Today, our guest is survivor leader and advocate Jessica Kay. With Jessica, we'll be talking about survivor voices in the anti-trafficking movement, hope and healing after trauma, what Jessica sees as long-term care needs for survivors of human trafficking, and the ever important discussion of full decriminalization and legalization of commercial sex. Please join us today with Jessica Kay.
I was so naive. I ended up losing my home and my car, and my son had to go live with his father. And that's when I met my trafficker. He groomed me for a really long time. I didn't know prostitution or trafficking was a thing, and I thought he was my boyfriend.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Jessica Kay. It is so wonderful and such an honor to have you with us today. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm really excited about this discussion.
Thank you. So let's just jump right in. And Jessica, share with our listeners the parts of your story you are comfortable sharing, your healing journey, and what you do to actively stay in a place of hope and healing.
So I was trafficked as a young person. So I was technically an adult, and I was trafficked for roughly 18 months. There's a little blur in timeline for me of when it started because I was groomed. So backstory, I'm from a really small town in Iowa, and we don't talk about hard things, right? We love to sweep them under the rug. We pretend hard things don't happen. And I had a really traumatic childhood. I grew up in a home that was filled with drug addiction. I was exposed to sex at a very young age, domestic violence, and just really a lot of chaos. Starting really as early as I can remember, one of my first memories is SWAT breaking into our house and raiding our house. And I was 5 at that time. And I say that because, one, I was a product of my environment, right? So I never really had hope or healing growing up, never felt seen or heard, which is why I think eventually I was, really vulnerable to this complex crime. So I went to college, I left home, I went to college, everything was fabulous. And I got pregnant with my son in college. And after I gave birth to my son, he was about a year old, I decided I needed a change, and I moved to Las Vegas, of all places. And Las Vegas was like super exciting to me because I had never seen like this much culture or lights or freeways for that matter, right? It's just very busy city, lots of opportunities, lots of cool people and food and things like that. And as I was like navigating my way in this new territory, I kind of ended up in really unhealthy relationships. Eventually found myself in a domestic violence relationship, just very unhealthy, that eventually led me to lose my house. And so I was homeless, and I had to have my son go live with his father because I could no longer take care of him. I just didn't have the means. And during that time, that's when I met my trafficker.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I didn't know he was a trafficker. I, really thought that he was my boyfriend. I thought that he loved me and cared for me. He gave me everything I needed. I needed a home. He gave me that. I needed protection. He gave me that. I needed bills paid. He helped me with those things. And the grooming process really took roughly about 6 months. And one day I had just left a job interview, and he came and picked me up. And on our way home, he turned up Tropicana, and that, wasn't our typical route home. And so I had asked him, like, where are we going? And so he said, oh, I have a friend that has some work for you. And so I was a little confused, but we pulled into the Orleans parking lot, and he pulled up to the curb, and this girl opened my door, and he took his foot to my upper thigh and kicked me out of the car and said, "Make daddy proud." And I will never forget that moment because I just was so confused and so really not even understanding like what was happening. And the girl kind of picked me up and she dusted me off and took me into the Orleans bathroom and essentially taught me the game. So she's like, this is what we're going to do. And We walked back out to the street where she negotiated my first client or buyer, right? And that night I worked over 10 hours to reach my quota. And the whole time, people often ask me, like, well, why didn't you just run? Well, he was sitting in the parking lot watching us. And I was also homeless. Where am I going to go? So after that 10 hours, I went home and I cried myself to sleep in the shower because I just felt lost, confused, filled with shame, right? The shame that comes with that, gross, dirty, all the things. And so for the next 18 months, I was forced to make $2,500 a night. Our trafficker didn't have any food in the house. He would only keep water. So we could only eat once we met our quota. He didn't physically beat us because he knew like physical marks, right, can deter buyers. But he would do other things. So he would strangle us. He would hold us at gunpoint. He would tie us together. He would lock us in closets. He would threaten to send us to brothels. The thing that always brought me back and kind of kept me in this loop, obviously the fear, right? The fear is real. But he would also send pictures of our kids like on the playground, and he knew where our families lived. And so that was a real fear of mine. So that was for 18 months, roughly. I eventually got arrested, like most of us do. And when I went to jail, I actually I was in contact still off and on with the person in the beginning of my story. So that domestic violence relationship. And when I left jail, I ran to him. I don't really think it was a conscious like decision of like, this is better than that. I just think like I was really trauma bonded to both of them. And at least I knew with my previous abuser that I wouldn't be forced to have sex with strangers for money. And so that's kind of how I left the life. And then I stayed in domestic violence for 8 more years. After I gave birth to my daughter, she was about, I think like 1.5. I overdosed and I went into a psychiatric facility. And that was really my turning point because one, I didn't think I should be there. And two, nobody asked me why. They just gave me medication and then they called my abuser to pick me up. And that 72 hours really made me realize like, one, I need to get out of this violent cycle that I'm in because either I'm going to kill myself or he's going to kill me. And then at that time I had 2 children, right? And those children deserve something different than what I experienced. I was just really determined to break those generational curses and change for my kids. At that time, my kids were my motivation to leave. And so after that, I got my bachelor's degree in elementary education, and that kind of gave me that pathway, right? That bump in income and really that stability that I needed. And then I got my master's degree after that in social work from USC.
Wow.
So that's the high level. Do you have any questions about my story before I talk about the healing?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a couple things. And then for our listeners who may not understand what the terminology the game means, can you explain what that may mean for those who may not understand that?
Yeah, like it's a slang for what we call, when we're living that lifestyle. So it will be referred to as the game or the life. So it's just a slang term for that culture, right? That culture of prostitution, pimping,
Yeah.
sex work, all those things. It's
Yeah. Yeah. Victim work, sexual violence in that. Yes, exactly. And then one of the other things, I mean, you know that I live in Montana and that's where we met. You came up here to speak at a conference that was taking place. There's so many things about your story, Jessica, that really touch my heart deeply. And I even heard a little bit more about your story, of which we have something very similar in common. But You've heard me talk about my mom. She was trafficked in a very rural environment in small farm town, South Dakota, back in the 1940s, where we didn't even have language for this type of sexual violence. Your story about coming from a small rural town in Iowa, I think we often have pictures of these small rural towns as these little Mayberry RFD pristine environments where nothing bad happens. What I've seen in Montana, what I know happened in South Dakota, there is violence that happens in these rural communities. There are drugs. There is sexual violence and rape that happens. There's incest that happens. There's trafficking that happens. There's mental health, substance abuse disorder. There's all of those things that you described that I know, the things that my mom experienced that I've seen in small rural towns here in Montana. And I think you nailed it when you said, we don't talk about those things.
No.
And that's one of the things that is so misleading about rural America and human trafficking is that we don't think the crime happens there. It does.
Yeah.
It does in big numbers. And it's shocking to people how hidden it is in these rural communities, in these rural areas.
And a lot of it's family, right?
Yes.
Familial trafficking, that is happening. I mean, but even over the last couple of years, we've heard stories of like Piper Lewis in Iowa, right? So
Yeah.
we do know that it's happening there. I think it just looks different. And I also think that it's kept quiet. I think a lot of the things that you mentioned are kept quiet because it's like, who knows who? And like, oh, that's the daughter of the city councilman.
Right.
So we can't talk about that. Or that's so-and-so's sister. Or so things are like kept in these little bubbles and a lot of people gossip about it, but like nobody wants to get involved. Nobody wants to take action. There's a lot of excuse making or even just ignorance of like choice. Like, well, it's her choice to stay with him.
A lot of victim shaming. Victim shaming.
Yeah.
And it may even be the people in authority that are doing the violence.
Yes.
And that's just another layer of intimidation and coercion and things like that we see in the rural communities and tribal reservations.
Yeah.
It is so much more prevalent in these communities than what we often think that they are.
Yes.
Then the other question I wanted to ask you about your story is people may think that commercial sex is legal in all of Nevada, and yet you were arrested. So can you clarify for folks that may have a misunderstanding of what it means in the legalization of commercial sex in Nevada and why was it you were arrested? You're the victim. Why was it you were arrested?
Yeah. So prostitution isn't legal in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is. Prostitution is only legal in certain rural counties in our state. And so that's where people get confused, right? And I don't think we stop the confusion, right? We have terms and slogans like what happens here stays here.
Yep.
So we've definitely created a haven of sex tourism. But yeah, so in Clark County, if you are coming to Las Vegas, prostitution is not legal in Clark County. So you have to go to rural areas for legalized prostitution.
Yeah. And once again, rural areas.
Yes.
Yep. Those rural areas.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying those things. And now move on to your which I love hearing about, your hope and your healing.
Well, healing is a process, right? It's not an event. And that is something that I really always try to keep into perspective, right? It's something that I have to tell myself often. Like any human who has experienced complex trauma, I have my good days, my bad days, and what I call my ugly cry days. And we've all had those. And on those really hard days, I try to lean in and give myself grace. And I also try to be really honest, not only with myself, but the people around me. So if I'm having a hard day, I try to communicate that to like my children, right?
Mhm.
so that they don't internalize my trauma as being a part of them, right? Or something that they did. So I really try to be
Mhm.
honest with anybody that I'm interacting with. If I have to interact with people on those hard days, that like I'm struggling and ooh, that's hard, right? To be that vulnerable. But again, it's a process. It's a process of self-discovery, self-understanding. Um, I've been in and out of therapy for years,
Mhm.
and I do struggle to find a therapist that really understands this complex crime. All of my therapists have helped me in their own ways and in
Mhm.
their own expertise, but I haven't found one that really gets it right when it comes down to this. Recently, I would say over the last year or so, my big push has been learning to connect to my body. So for many years, I disassociated from my body. I went into like trauma drive, right? So the more accolades I get, the more degrees I get, the more money I make, the more, right? Just disassociated from everything and just push myself.
Mhm.
COVID really made me sit with myself, and whew, that was that was hard, right? To really be forced to sit with myself. And so over the last couple of years, learning to connect with my body again and really understanding that my body is telling me when I'm having a trauma response. And I can't ignore when I'm shaking. A lot of times I shake when I talk. I can't ignore when I feel that gut feeling of don't do this or don't go there or I don't feel like it, right? And I've had to learn how to lean into that. I've had to learn how to say no because I can't be everywhere all the time, all at once, because it just is draining to me. And so connecting with my body has been the journey over the last couple of years and doing like somatic exercises, learning how to understand my body, how to move my body, how to not be shamed of my body,
Mhm.
how to release the trauma from my body has really been pivotal in my healing journey. And recently I had the epiphany, I guess, that the more that I heal my body and my inner child, the more playful and the more authentic and the more artistic that I become. And I find that really beautiful. I find it really beautiful. There was one point where like I just wanted to play and paint, and it had gotten to a point where it was like becoming a need. Like I just wanted to play with textures and create, um, that I had to just like listen and go to Michael's and buy things that I don't know. I'm not like super artistic, like let's
Yeah.
be honest. But I'm learning
Yeah.
and I am artistic in certain ways, right? I'm a really great writer. I do love photography. Photography is one of my greatest passions, and I do like nature photography. So I know that I'm artistic, but like I can't draw like for so, I walked around Michael's and was like, "Ooh, this like looks fun," right? Made a big mess. My daughter's an artist, so it's been like a great bonding experience. But I didn't know that. Like nobody said like, "Hey, when you start to heal this inner child, like you're gonna really want to play and be more open and authentic." Like I went to a business meeting. I did a speaking engagement at UNLV actually, and if you know me, I'm typically very, very serious. And I got up that morning and I was like looking in my closet and I was like, gonna put on the typical like suit jacket and high
Mhm.
heels and all the things. And I was like, I'm going to talk to college kids. I'm wearing sneakers,
Yeah.
some sweatpants, and a hoodie. And I think because I showed up authentically, that really brought them out, right? And really created this authentic experience for both them and me
Yeah.
versus like coming in there with that suit jacket and being like, okay, we're going to talk about this hard thing. And so now I'm in the messy phase of like figuring that out. Like, who am I authentically? Who do I want to show up as? And how do I do that on a regular basis?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked with the same thing, and it's so amazing. Jenna McKay is one of the survivors that we also talked about, and she said so much of what you're saying as well in her healing journey, in her healing process. And it's that discovery of who we are. That's part of every single one of us that's walking in this planet. But when you are a person that has experienced so much trauma, and I think you once again nailed it when you said you were struggling to find a therapist who understood
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
layers of trafficking trauma. I think the entire medical community still doesn't understand those layers, and they're still trying to figure out what that does to the body. And at least from my perspective, when I do training, I still find a lot of the medical community in the dark on what happens to an individual when they're trafficked. So I think the whole medical community is still in that place of getting through elementary school and the middle school level and entering that high school level. I don't quite think the medical community is fully at the college level yet.
No, and I also don't think. First of all, let me say this. I love Jenna McKay. Okay, she's incredible. She's one of my favorite humans and somebody I lean into quite often. And watching her healing journey, kind of simultaneously with mine is such an incredible gift. And I know she has an incredible therapist. Like
Yeah.
she got the good one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But this is part of the reason why I decided to at least get my LCSW, is to have some better understanding of the clinical side of things. One thing that frustrates me, even in my own story, is that, I went into the psych facility and I was just labeled at that point. I think they labeled me bipolar 2, when really my symptoms were of abuse, right? And
Mhm.
so too often victims of crime are labeled with the amount of diagnoses I see, right? They'll have 7 or 8 different diagnoses, and really it's trauma.
Right.
And then what happens is we start resonating with our diagnoses, right? And then we're like, oh, yeah, I guess like I must be bipolar or I must be borderline. But even people are coming out now with borderline and talking about how that really is a trauma response to
Mhm.
narcissistic abuse,
Mhm.
right? And so I think at some point, and hopefully we will continue on this continuum of a better understanding of these diagnoses and how complex trauma plays a role or gives us symptoms of those diagnoses, but it's not necessarily that diagnoses. And I don't think we should be so quick to label and tell them their diagnoses
Yeah.
if it's not benefiting them at that moment. So I'm a therapist that believes we should diagnose very, very low for quite a while, right? For
Mhm.
6 months to a year, so we can really see the whole person and not just the symptoms of their trauma.
So true. I agree with you. And I think we have a long way to go before we even understand trauma that comes through DNA.
Oh yeah.
And, the similarities in our stories on a personal level. And this is not a surprise to, I'm not, I don't keep this quiet. I took an overdose of prescription medication when I was in high school, my senior year of high school, because I felt lost. I couldn't connect from my heart to my head. I couldn't connect the emotions that I was feeling and experiencing, the anger, the aloneness, the feeling of lost. I grew up in a beautiful home with two parents that worked, and I was in a stable environment, but I had no idea why, as this young child, I had so much anger and so much fear and so much anxiety inside me. I had no idea. And finally, for me, at a senior in high school, I was just
Yeah.
tired. I was tired of that because I had no answers. I had no explanation. And so I too took an overdose of drugs and ended up 72 hours in the psychiatric ward, given no rhyme or reason why I was there. My parents were told at that time never to talk with me about what had happened. And my mom came and picked me up from the hospital and drove me to school in complete silence. And I was in the exact same clothes that I went into the hospital in and had my stomach pumped out 3 days earlier. And for 10 years, my family never spoke of this. And that's why for me, I say we still have such a long way to go to understand trauma, to understand those levels of what that means into secondary survivors as well, family members. We don't just inherit blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, blonde hair, brown hair, olive skin. We don't just inherit just that.
Right.
We inherit a lot more in that DNA.
We do. And there is research starting to come out. I had read an article the other day, and I cannot tell you what it is called, but it was talking about how it skips a generation. So essentially my trauma would come from my grandmother, right? And even just thinking about like the trauma of like, what was that trauma? I know some now, and really, I only know some of that now because I have forced my family into having courageous conversations because I'm talking about it with the world. So I feel like we should probably talk about it.
The hardest conversation to have is right there. Is that the most courageous conversations are the hardest one to have? They're with your family and your loved ones.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do agree. I think we have a long way to go. But the one thing I was thinking while you were telling me your story is kind of really who I am at my soul and at my core. And when I think about the work that I do, is that human connection is the most powerful healing agent we have. And the more that we share our stories, the more we can continue to help others like break that shame down, because we recognize that like I'm not the only one that's been put in the psych ward and nobody talked to me about it, right? You have a very similar story. And even as a child, I was self-harming before self-harming was a thing, right? I was doing these behaviors and having these behaviors, and we ignored them. And so, now as an adult, there's a lot of healing that comes from that. And there's healing from other people's stories and then survivors. One thing we don't really talk about is when you put survivors together, that is such a gift for us because there is this like just shared understanding.
Yeah.
And we can connect on a level that really there's not really words to put to when we're able to bond and connect with other survivors.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been fortunate to witness that, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's one of those things that gives me hope, hearing you talk about what you're doing now and the work you're doing now and the level of understanding you are gaining, not only for yourself, but for your children, for those that you're working with, and you're feeling a need out there, which is one of the questions I have for you is, what long-term services are needed for trafficking survivors?
The list is long, so we're not going to go into all the nooks and crannies of the things I think we need. But I do think first we have to strengthen the safety nets for at-risk youth and vulnerable populations, right? A lot of trafficking is occurring because we're vulnerable. So many youth find themselves like engaging in survival sex, which is where they'll meet their trafficker, right? Because they're forced to. So I think one of the first steps is really strengthening the safety nets and making sure that people have their basic needs met, right? Because we know that if basic needs are met, they're less likely to have to do things or put themselves in communities or situations that could be harmful to them.
Yeah.
We need preventative education and programs in our schools, in our systems, right? Whether that's juvenile justice, foster care, Boys and Girls Club. We need to talk about it because if you don't know that trafficking is a thing, then how can you protect yourself from it, right? So we really need to help youth understand what trafficking is, understand what consent is, right? And understand and really give them the tools to protect themselves from this horrific crime. And that is a big thing for me, right? Because I didn't know prostitution was a thing. We didn't talk about that growing up. It wasn't a part of conversation. So if I didn't know that these things were happening in broad daylight and in the streets, then I couldn't protect myself from those harmful behaviors. Early intervention programs that focus on offering like survivors of violence and abuse wraparound services that can help them navigate and heal from their complex trauma. And there's intersecting needs there, right? But if you're a victim of domestic violence, you're probably more likely to also become a victim of human trafficking, right? There's an intersection there.
Right.
If you're homeless, you're more likely to become a victim of human trafficking because it intersects. So getting people the services that they need, regardless of the crime, and giving them those long-term services, right? Too often we're putting band-aids on gunshot wounds
Right.
and sending people home.
Right.
We need, for trafficking specifically, we need more long-term housing for both minors and adults. And we need pathways out for adults. So we need job training. We need access to education. Listen, I have $300,000 in student loan debt, and I don't qualify for public service loan forgiveness, despite the fact that I'm a therapist. And 80% of the population I serve is on Medicaid, right? But I don't qualify. And so, I'm in debt to get those degrees. We need job stability, and we need people to work with us in order to get those jobs, right? When I was trying to build my career, my criminal record almost stopped me from that. Eventually, I was able to get my record sealed and move forward with building my career, but it was a barrier. And because of my criminal record, I was forced on unemployment because I left one job, took another job, and then they couldn't hire me because of my criminal record. And so it created this barrier for me, and lack of stability could easily send me right back into that vulnerable situation again. We need specialized training for law enforcement and the legal system in general. We need more clinicians that really are equipped with the knowledge of this complex crime and how human trafficking victims and survivors, like how that manifests in us, like what that looks like. But we need more funding.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The whole time you're saying all this incredible list, and folks can't see us talking to one another, but I'm over here shaking my head and nodding my head the whole time you're talking. And I was thinking the exact same thing when you just said that. All of the majority of that, if we're talking about the government level, that's paid for out of tax dollars.
And I also see, one of the biggest issues that I see is that organizations, even if they're doing great work, right, are typically forced to put the Band-Aid on the gunshot wound because they need the numbers to acquire the money. And so we may have served 500 clients, but how many of those were actually transformative? Like, how many of those clients actually had a transformative experience? Not many, maybe 50%. And so what I would like to see is maybe our numbers come down, but transformation is in greater numbers, right? And so that they don't come back through and we just keep repeating the cycle, right? Like, let's get them real help so they can go thrive, right? That's what we want. We want them to thrive. We want them to be productive members of society and be happy and fulfilled. And we can't if they're stuck in this cycle that they can't get out of.
Yeah, absolutely. I so agree, and so well said. And that kind of leads me to my next question. And some of this you've answered, but I think there's another level that you give such a great voice to. And the survivor's voice is critical in the fight against human trafficking. From your very unique perspective, what areas in the anti-trafficking world are greater platforms needed for survivor voices? And how do survivors best advocate for one another?
The dynamic of this crime is constantly changing, right? And we know this because we are survivor informed, right? And we need to get that information from victims and survivors so that we understand how this crime is constantly changing, right? So first and foremost, survivor voices should be integral in every part of the movement because we can provide a victim-centered perspective. We can drive advocacy efforts. We can challenge misconceptions. And we can really just contribute to building a more compassionate and informed approach to addressing these complex issues. I really believe that survivor voices should be from policies and procedures all the way into policy from federal, state level, right? We need survivor voices in every part. We need survivor mentors. We need survivors building programs. We need survivors helping other companies and organizations figure out how they can help victims of human trafficking. Uh, the one thing that I want to say about this is that I think it's really important that we also understand that survivors have a choice. They need to always have a choice if, when, and how their story is being told or if it's being told. Not every survivor who goes on their healing journey wants to be a part of the movement. Not every survivor wants to tell their story on a big platform. Not every survivor wants to say, like, hey, I got services from X, Y, and Z organization, donate now, right? And I've seen far too often survivors pushed into the movement or pushed to tell their story when they're not ready, when they haven't done the work themselves, right? We also need to heal, because if we're pushed into this movement and into these hard conversations too soon, we're going to re-trigger ourselves. We're going to do harm to ourselves and to those that we're working with. And also, if an organization is really pushing a survivor to tell their story before they're ready, before that they've gone through like ethical storytelling, before somebody has taught them, like, how do you want your story to be told? And what is your message? And if they're forcing you or pushing you to tell your story before you're ready, that's exploitation.
Yes.
And that needs to stop, because it is doing harm not only to the survivor, but also to the whole movement and to survivor leaders across the country. They need a voice in whether or not they become a part of the movement, whether their story is out there, whether they want to promote an organization or not. We need to have that as our choice and our choice alone.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are such big points. And I was hoping those would be the points that you would make. And I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen that with organizations that have exploited, and there's one specific organization and a survivor that I'm thinking of right now who was in no way, shape, or form ready to tell the story on the stage that this particular organization wanted her to tell her story. And it set this particular survivor just back years. And it was heartbreaking to watch. And I'll also share from an organization point, I'll share that we've had some survivors that have wanted to tell their story, and we've had to bring in some victim specialists and with compassion and love say, we don't think you're ready to tell your story. And our main goal is we protect survivors. So the survivors that we're giving voice to and give platform to, they've identified how they're ready to tell that.
Yeah.
There have been times where it has been very hard to say to some survivors that we're not the platform for you because we just don't think you're ready. And we think it's going to hurt you. And some who have come back later and said, thank you, I wasn't ready. I was absolutely not ready. They either felt pressured or they felt the desire for affirmation, and they wanted to still feel the love and the acceptance, but it would have come in a false way. And it's a hard path to journey down. But when you have survivors like yourself and Jenna, who we've talked about, and some of the other survivors that we work with that come alongside us and say, we're here to be that mentor.
Yeah.
We have some amazing victim specialists that we work with within the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office and different levels of government that work with us and are part of our task force that come alongside as well. And that's been, I think, one of the biggest lessons for us to learn as an organization is how we protect that survivor and give platform to the survivor voice.
No, I think that's super important. And thank you for protecting them, right? And I think it's important we find ways, if they do feel like they're ready, to better equip them, right? And
Yes.
so, okay, we hear you, you're ready.
Yeah.
Let's start with a small group of trusted people and see how you do,
Yeah.
right? Let's have you take a speech class, or let's have you work with survivor mentors, right? I have other survivors that have came before me that teach me so much,
Yes.
contract negotiation, or
Yes.
one of them recently told me, like, your rates are too low, right? And different things. They've helped me with trainings. They've, given me guidance and just love and that affirmation that we sometimes need on this journey. And so, yeah, I think it's an important part of the conversation is how do we equip the survivors who want to
Right.
be a part of this movement? I also have heard far too many times that organizations will go after these vulnerable survivors because they don't know how to ask for compensation. Survivors who are healed in their journey, 99% of the time, we are going to ask for compensation. We are going to have demand compensation.
Yeah.
We're not just going to let you have us speak at a fundraiser while you raise a $500,000 and we don't have food on the table,
Right.
because that's a reality for many of us, right? And so, how do we stop that? How do we continue to raise survivor voices who want to be raised? Are part of these conversations that are necessary.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the word that keeps coming to my mind is community.
Yeah.
It's really building that community and that safe place to have those conversations, have the understanding, have the education. You nailed it also. One of the things that you said that I do see happening. I want it to happen a lot faster, but it is law enforcement training. I want to see it happen a lot faster than what I'm seeing it, but I am seeing it. And there was a study that was just released. I think it was March 1st of this year. It was the National Institute for Justice, and I'll send you the link to it. But it was a study that was just released on the link between how a police officer or law enforcement officer writes their report if they've identified a victim of sexual violence, how they write their report and the prosecution and how the victim is treated. And it's language that goes into that report. It is.
Which matters.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to send you that link because I think it was such an important study that was done, and it gives credibility to things that I know you've said, to that we say in our organization, and what we hear so many other survivors out there saying, as well as some of the law enforcement that we work with, is that there has to be more education, in that field and so many of the fields. But
I think education is a tiny part. But when we talk about the education piece, I also think we need to bring in survivor voices and stories, because what I have seen within law enforcement, legal systems in general, is that one, they've worked in the field, so they have their own bias. A lot of times they still believe it's a choice because of how we try to protect ourselves, right? We can come off as if this is our choice. And a lot of times we'll even defend our trafficker because we're trauma bonded, right? And so when you bring that human perspective and you bring the survivor in to tell the story of how this happened to her, the violence she endured on the back end, it awakens the human in the police officer or in the judge or in the whoever, and it gives them a greater understanding of the manipulation, of the trauma bonding, of the gaslighting, of the violence that is happening off, like in the background, right? Especially in Nevada, right? A lot of us are trafficked in casinos, and so it appears to be fun.
Yeah.
We look like we're having fun. That's really a defense mechanism, right? We transform into whoever our buyer wants us to be for those 2 hours or that hour or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's, looks can be deceiving. And so we really have to not only bring in the HT 101 curriculum, but we also need to bring in people that were trafficked in that region, because across the country it looks different. So me telling my story, I could tell it in Las Vegas. I could probably also tell it in Atlantic City, where there's casinos, very similar like type of layout. But I'm very much here, right? My story happened here. yes, it can relate into rural other towns because that's how I grew up, but it doesn't necessarily translate into this is what trafficking looks like in this state or in
Yeah,
this city.
yeah. Oh, so well said. Although come to Billings where we've got a casino on every block and every
Yeah.
corner. Good
I mean,
gracious.
casinos are
Ah,
becoming, yes, they are over the last few years, they're starting to pop up everywhere. And so, yes, how I was trafficked in
everywhere.
casinos can definitely become more relevant across the country now. But 5 years
Yeah,
ago, we didn't have
yeah.
casinos like that
Yeah.
in other
Yeah,
places.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so well said. And that just, it's a great segue into this next conversation that we're going to be having, which is a conversation I feel like I have almost every single week right now. And it's a conversation that I like having. But I think the most important voices in the entire area of trafficking, but this area is so critical because we're going to be talking about something in the legal area. Certain lobbying groups in some of our states are pushing for full decriminalization and legalization of commercial sex. I believe human trafficking survivors have the most important voice on this subject. So, first, share with our listeners, Jessica, what full decriminalization of commercial sex is. And second, from your survivor perspective, how do you believe full decriminalization and legalization of commercial sex will impact victims of commercial sex in
Yeah.
trafficking?
So, full decriminalization of prostitution means removing all legal penalties and criminal sanctions against adults who engage in prostitution. So, this is for both buyers and sellers, right? So, this would also not hold buyers accountable.
Yeah.
Now, with full decriminalization, traffickers would still be held accountable. But from my perspective, I think it would be even harder to hold them accountable when now everything else is there's no criminal penalties for those things, right? So the legalization and decriminalization of prostitution creates an environment where vulnerable people can still be exploited, but now it's within like a legal framework, right? We see this here because in Nevada we have legalization, right? We have
Yes.
legalization of prostitution, and we have become a hotspot for sex tourism due to this. I think what people need to understand is legal doesn't equate to safe,
Yes. Yes.
right? My trafficker had girls in brothels. So he had, I think, 2 or 3 girls in the brothel at the time. And going to a brothel was always a threat for us because it provides the environment where like control is easier, right? Because once you're in the brothel, you can't leave until it's your weekend off, right? So you may be in there weeks or months at a time.
Hmm.
So trafficking is still happening in brothels, and brothel owners are just legalized pimps, right? We currently have a lawsuit. Jane Doe,
Right.
survivor Jane Doe, is so brave and has came out and filed a lawsuit against brothels and many people in the state of Nevada for it being unsafe. And so that is just a testament. And she's not the only one. Although I was never forced into the brothel, I have many survivor sisters who were in brothels and trafficked throughout the brothels. So full decriminalization and full legalization only create a whirlwind for the demand. If we don't start going after demand, it's going to be really hard to combat this.
Right.
I think that other people also need to understand that when men purchase us, there's imbalance of power and control. And once that money is exchanged, we are now seen as their property for that hour or 2 hours or night.
Hmm.
Many buyers are violent. So the violence that we endure is not just from our trafficker. We are enduring violence from buyers. So this is not a pretty woman scenario. This is not when we get to go shopping on, Saks Fifth Avenue and use their credit card. That is not what the majority of this looks like. It's very violent. Once they pay you, they own you. So that means that they often will break the terms that you agreed upon, right? And do what they want with you. I suffered more violence or just as much violence from buyers than I did from my trafficker. And so I think people need to understand that this isn't just a boys' club in. They just want to have sex and move on. That's typically not always how this is happening. Sometimes that's how this is happening, but a lot of times it is not what is actually happening.
Right. And I think The point you're making, there's so many points in there that you're making. They're so good. That point about when the buyer puts down the money, they own you. They just purchased your freedom and now they're in control. And that's why human trafficking often is referred to as modern day slavery. You're buying another person's freedom. And some of the survivors that we work with out of Clark County and out of different parts of Nevada where it isn't legal, but the misunderstanding that going to Nevada, it's going to be legal. And they see the violence escalate because that buyer thinks it's legal. They can get away with whatever they're doing and their conscience can leave okay because it was legal.
Yeah. It's paid rape.
It is. That's absolutely right.
They're paying to live out their sexual fantasies, whether
Yes.
we agree to those terms or not.
Yes.
There, typically is negotiation between victim and buyer, but that does not mean once the buyer pays you, he has the power, right? And so oftentimes those negotiations don't hold true.
Yeah.
They also, a lot of times, once they know that it is they're already breaking the law. So to them, they're like, well, you're not going to go to the police because you're going to be in trouble for selling sex.
Right.
Right. And so that just is a breeding ground for violence. We can't remove the inherent violence in prostitution. We can't remove that.
Right.
If we make it legal, if we give it a pretty name like sex work, like we can't remove that inherent violence.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, we've removed the phrase sex work. And for us, we call them victim and victim workers. We do a lot of work on the illicit massage industry and helping to break the barriers for the victim workers in the illicit massage industry. These are not sex workers. They are very much victim workers.
Oh.
And those are some of the things that we still have a long way to go in our country. We've come far, but we still have a very, very long way to go, especially when we're talking about children and the level of violence that we are seeing happen with children with the prevalence of the internet and what we're seeing explode in the internet and what we're going to be seeing happening. I mean, we're just seeing the little teeny tiny tip of the iceberg on AI. We're just seeing the little teeny tiny tip of the iceberg on that.
I was just watching a video last night on TikTok, right? We all love TikTok. And it was a normal girl, just a normal human with a normal job. And she was on vacation and she was talking about how all of a sudden she started getting sent these videos of her on a porn site talking about erectile dysfunction. And they had taken a video from her like Instagram or TikTok and deep faked her, right? So that's the new term, deep fake porn. And I think that this is going to be the new form of exploitation. And if we don't get ahead of this, if we do not work to understand this, we are in trouble. And for any of the parents listening, you need to be watching your children and what they're doing on the internet and how they're doing things. I have worked on some child cases where even the parents were like, I looked at that account. I did all the research I could. I thought this was real. And unfortunately, their child became a victim of exploitation. Yeah. And boys are being exploited at the same rate as girls, especially on the internet these days. Yeah. And so your boys aren't safe either. We really need to understand how the internet is fueling this economy of exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just said the right word, economy, because that's really what it comes down to with the different big tech platforms that are out there. This is big business. And the reality is that every single one of us are 2 clicks away online from seeing a child sexually live tortured, and people making money off of that. And as of right now, the United States has absolutely no federal policies over AI at all. So I hope all those parents that are listening get involved. And we always say that too. And this is going to lead up to our last question. But just to put out there is know your child's usernames, passwords, what apps are on a smartphone. I am one of those adults that believes that the longer you wait to give a child a smartphone, the better. The more healthy that is for the child, the better your relationship will be, the better childhood that child will have. I am one of those that does believe that. Put off those social media accounts as long as you can.
I also think like the sooner, like once you decide to give them a smartphone, take control of that smartphone from the beginning.
Yes.
So if you nowadays you can have apps where you can literally see what's on their phone.
Yeah.
The parent can control their phone from their phone. If you do that from the moment they have a cell phone, it's not going to be a fight. It's going to be normalized.
Right.
Don't wait until they're in trouble to set rules around the cell phone. Set those from the beginning. And as hard as it is, stick with that and hold true to those boundaries that you set with your child.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and so well said. So, Jessica, on this show, we tell our listeners what they can do to help combat human trafficking in their communities. What are 2 to 3 simple key actions or steps that people can take today, this week, to be one of those champions to fight human trafficking in their community?
I mean, first and foremost, listen to survivors, right? Really, if someone tells you that they are a victim of this crime, if they come to you, if they confide in you, believe them, see them, hear them, and support them all the way through the process, right? Be that person for them, because we all, as humans, victims or not, need a champion in our lives, right? When we're going through hard times. So, in my story, when I tell my speech, the last line of my speech is every time you hear us, we heal. And part of that healing process is really reclaiming our voice. And so I think that is the simplest thing that people can do. So whether you're just somebody in the community, right? Or if you're in organizations, have survivor voices as a part of your work to combat this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to piggyback. So I'm going to give you 2 things, but kind of 3. So the other one is do your research on organizations before donating to them, right? So ask victims and survivors, ask advocates that you trust, pull their I-90 or their whatever those documents are called that shows where their money is going. Really dig in and make sure that you're giving to an organization that is doing really good work and is trusted in the community by survivors. So that's just kind of a caveat. And then the last thing is I think that we have to work together to stop the culture of tolerance and normalization that surrounds the marketplace for commercial sexual exploitation. We owe it to victims and survivors to accurately describe the violence that they have endured and combat human trafficking through both our words and our actions. Awareness is everything, right?
Yes.
But it really achieves absolutely nothing without actions. And so I think we must collectively work towards a future where people are safe and free and have the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And that was a good point about look up the organization that you may or may not know about, or maybe you just saw a movie and that movie now draws you to that organization. Look up the organization first. Look up the leaders, look up the founders, look up the board members, who's on their committees, and
Google them online.
Yes, exactly. Do something simple like that. Yes, exactly.
Right? Like even social media, because, not that we want to talk about that movie, but
Right.
survivors were speaking up.
Yes.
And survivors were getting backlash for speaking up.
Yes.
And so the easiest way is like just putting organization names into Facebook, Instagram, like you're going to find
Yes.
information.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things I was going to add is every nonprofit organization, if they're a 501c3 or whatever type of organization might be, if they're registered with their state, which they have to be, they legally have to be, they have to submit an annual report every year. And you should see on that annual report, plus the fact you should be with an organization that is providing a public platform for their quarterly reports or their financial reports or whatever it might be. Our organization, we give a quarterly report publicly where we actually bring out our financial statement and we show everything of what we either brought in or what we distributed. And we're not an organization that does big galas or fundraisers or things like that. We raise funds for the specific project that we're doing that moves that specific need forward or meets that need. But that is one of the things I love that point. And you're actually the first person who has said that. And I love that point. But yeah, people can go look right on their Secretary of State website and find that annual report and look to see how they're spending that money and where that money's going.
Yeah. And really, if you can find a survivor-led organization in your community, that is where you should go. A lot of survivor-led organizations are grassroots,
Yeah.
and they're underfunded because they're not serving the 500 people, or they don't have the money to get a lot of the grants because most grants, especially like federal and state grants, are reimbursable grants.
Right.
So if they don't already have 50,000 in the bank, they're not going to be able to submit for this 50,000 grant. And so a lot of survivor-led organizations are extremely underfunded. But what a lot of people don't realize is the survivor-led organizations are the ones that are in the streets.
Yeah.
They are front line. They are getting their hands dirty and really feeling not only the physical, but the mental and emotional impact of what is happening to the people that they are trying to help.
Yeah.
Because they're understaffed, underpaid.
And they're typically all volunteer.
Right.
Oftentimes they're all volunteer. And those federal grants, just like what you were talking about, they require, you have to state how many staff members you've got. They require an employment base to show who's going to be overseeing it. And a lot of these organizations that are grassroots, and I couldn't agree with you more, they're volunteer. And I will also share, because I love what you're saying, for organizations that are out there, like we're a task force. For other task forces, so task forces typically are a combined group of different organizations that are coming together. And for us, it's our leadership is the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office, and then the Montana Department of Justice. So we're heavy in the legal. So we've got oversight coming out the yin. I mean, we're just that's all we are, But we also have those organizations that are like the YWCAs. And those are the typical organizations you're going to see in some of the states that are more rural. You may not find a lot of survivor-led organizations in some of the more rural states. You're going to find the YWCAs, maybe the domestic violence shelters. You're going to find some of those organizations. They may be faith-based. They may be out of a church or something to that nature. You're going to find some of those type of organizations more in the smaller rural communities. But those are often the organizations that are the ones that are neck and neck and working and doing those wraparound services with the survivors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to understand too that there's something at every level where they can be activated, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times we need clothing, right?
Yes.
Donate your clothing to groups who, serve human trafficking victims. We need pathways out. So if you're a business owner, create a space for a survivor that you're willing to hire and train and pour into. Provide mentorship for whatever field you're in to a survivor. Hygiene supplies, right?
Yes.
There's so many ways. It does not have to be a monetary donation for you to be able to get involved and activated. Wherever you are, there is a need that could be filled because of your gift of whatever that is, right? So that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's as simple as changing your language. Sometimes it's as simple as opening your mind and understanding that prostitution is not the oldest profession.
It's the oldest oppression.
It's the oldest oppression, exactly. And agriculture is actually the oldest profession.
I didn't know that. But now I have to.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly. We often, we oftentimes lead with that. Is sometimes if the first step you want to take is something that is easy as changing the way you speak about something, change the way you think about and speak about this, because that's going to have a ripple effect on your actions. long term and long run.
Right.
Oh my gosh, Jessica, I could talk to you for hours and hours. And I so open the door for you to have this conversation with our task force in whatever way, we have mutual friends. And so know that door is open always for you, and in ways that we can work on this, because it is going to take all of us coming from different states coming together to really attack this nationally. And so many of us are doing that, but it is just what you said. It's that human connection and bringing together the stories and the voices and the actions that are taking place in my state, taking place in your state, because it's going to take all of our voices to change this at the federal level.
Yeah.
And it's going to take support systems to change it at your local level, at your state level. It's going to take support systems from other states coming in to help you do that. We are in this together. And I love what you said about that human connection, because that just really nails it in so many ways. Jessica Kay, thank you so much for your voice today and you coming on and being our guest today. It was such a learning experience, I know, for me, and I know for our listeners. You've opened my mind and my heart to so many things, and I'm just so grateful to you. To learn more about Jessica Kay and to book her as a speaker, and we encourage you that you do that quickly. Don't hesitate. Run to her website at iamjessicakay.com and get information on how you can book Jessica as a speaker for your next conference, for your webinar, how you can get in touch with her, help her with the work that she's doing there in Nevada and throughout our nation. And we will have information on topics discussed today on our task force website, as well as having your information. Jessica will have that on our website as well. So we encourage you, listeners, to go to our website at YHTTF. Make sure I said that correctly, YHTTF.org. As always, thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing this journey with us. Join us next week when our guest will be singer and actress Juliet Angelo. If you suspect labor or sex trafficking in the state of Montana, please call 833-406-7867. If you are being trafficked and need help, please call 911. If you suspect labor or sex trafficking outside of the state of Montana, please call your regional FBI office. You may also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888.